This video presentation is for tipped employees and how to calculate wages for tipped employees. One, a tipped employee is anybody that receives at least $30 in tips. And what are tips? Tips are a gift or gratuity given by a customer in recognition of some service performed for that customer. I think most of us think of a tipped employee as someone that works at a restaurant, so a server at a restaurant. So what happens is all employees that are covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act have to make, of course, minimum wage, which is currently $7.25 an hour. Even tipped employees have to receive that. But the employers of tipped employees are given a tip credit of $5.12 an hour. So really, they only have to pay tipped employees $2.13 an hour. I'm getting that by just taking $7.25 minus the $5.12 tip credit equals $2.13 an hour. Okay. So therefore, if a tipped employee works 40 hours a week, really their employer is only going to pay them $85.20. So if they work 40 hours a week times $2.13 an hour, that ends up being $85.20. Okay. Now, as I said before, a tipped employee still has to make minimum wage. So what should happen is between the $2.13 an hour given by the employer and tips, hopefully the tipped employee is making minimum wage. So what they have to go home with, if you think about minimum wage, 40 hours times $7.25 is $2.90. They have to go home with at least $2.90, but that includes this $85.20 plus tips. Okay. Now, if a tipped employee does not make enough tips to equal $290 when you factor in wages, then the employer has to make up the difference. Okay. So let's look at a couple of examples. All right. Here's one. We've got reported tips is $43. Okay, and we're assuming a 40-hour work week for all of this. Must the employer pay additional wages over $2.13 an hour? Well, in this case, what we've got is, again, they have to go home, wages and tips, they've got to go home with at least $2.90. Okay, so here, they've made $43 in tips. I'm going to take that away from my $2.90, leaving me with, they need another $247. Okay, so of course the employer is going to go ahead and pay $85.20 to them, but do they owe them more than that? Is $247 more than $85.20? Yeah, so $247 is greater than $85.20, so the employer has to pay additional wages. Let's see how much they would be. All you would have to take is $247. They've got to go home with an additional $247. So $247 minus the $85.20 that they're already paying, it's going to be $161.80. So the additional wages that the employer has to pay is $161.80. They're going to they will really pay them the full $247, so that their wages of $247 plus the $43 in tips equals our magic $290 number. Okay, let's look at another example. So here we've got reported tips of $1,189. I wouldn't mind making that during the week. All right. So does the employer have to pay additional wages over $2.13 an hour? Obviously not, right? You've got $11.89. Oops, $11.89. Scratch that out. $11.89 is greater than $2.90. Okay? Now, so the employer doesn't have to pay any additional wages, but do they still have to pay the $2.13 an hour? Yeah. So the employer must pay only the normal wage of $2.13 an hour. Okay? Or what that equates to is $85.20 for the week. Okay? So you could make $1 million in tips, and the employer would still just have to pay $85.20. Okay? Let's look at one more example. Here we've got reported tips of 111. All right, and again, we're assuming a 40-hour work week. Okay? Well, so we take $2.90. That's what they have to go home with during the week by minimum wage standards, minus what they're taking home in tips. That gives me $179. So they still need another $179 to make up to minimum wage. So of course that is greater than that $2.13 an hour number, $85.20. So is the employer going to have to pay additional wages? Yeah. So the employer is going to have to pay additional wages of, we'll take 179 minus 85.20, so that ends up being 93.80. So in total, the employer would have to write a check for really 179, but that 179 is made up of the 85.20 and this 93.80 number. And that is all about tipped employees.